Broadcasting live from Forward Observer Central Command in Austin, Texas. It's the man always out front on the issues. You're listening to Out Front with Mike Shelby.
All right. Hello and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Out Front. Welcome to the new channel. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. On today's show, we're looking at China, and for a very good reason. I ask, is there about to be a humanitarian crisis and political collapse in China? The situation is not looking good from a Chinese perspective. It also makes me rethink somewhat the risk that China poses to the United States and to the dollar regarding this BRICS, the Chinese-led BRICS, trying to replace the dollar for roughly half of the world, one-third to one-half of the world. All right. Lively comment section. Guys, again, I really appreciate everyone who migrated over from Forward Observer. If you like my message and if you believe that the things I talk about are important, I just ask that you share this channel and share the podcast, share the link with your friends and family who also may be interested. Now, let's start off by looking at something that was reported over at Forward Observer this morning. U.S. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said that the United States needs to secure its supply chain. And this is something that she could have said 2 years ago and been on target and also on time. Saying it now is kind of 2 years too late. And here's what she said, quote, "Our supply chains are not secure and they're not resilient. And I think that's something in terms of long-term risk to the United States and to other countries. That's a threat that needs to be addressed." And Dustin brought up this morning in this morning's report over at Forward Observer, brought up the topic of decoupling from China. And this has kind of been a theme for the past few years at Forward Observer. It has been slow going. However, it is going to remake the global economy when it does happen, when it actually accelerates and begins to pick up. And this is going to be a major turning point in history. Not to mention that it's going to happen in a Cold War with China and potentially a hot war with China as well. So I came across some new information this morning, and it has caused me to reconsider a couple of things. By the way, go ahead and put your questions into the chat, and we'll get to them at the end of the show as always. I came across some new information. Here's the headline. China halts auctions of wheat reserves before new harvest. Quote, this is from Reuters. China has stopped its weekly wheat auctions from state reserves earlier than last year when stocks were higher, traders and analysts said. The story continues. Beijing had been releasing only about 500,000 tons of wheat from the reserves in weekly auctions recently, compared with 4 million tons at some auctions in 2021. So these weekly wheat auctions they're now at 500,000 tons versus up to 4 million tons last year. And it's an anonymous source. If you don't know how I feel about anonymous sources, I generally dislike them. Because I want to know what the source description is. I want to know who this guy is. Apparently, this guy works for some state institution in China. He's obviously not at liberty to share this information. These reports are a lot like reading human intelligence reports, by the way. Writing human intelligence reports as well. Here's the quote from a Chinese official who works in some state institution. Quote, "A lot of the wheat was consumed last year." He's talking about wheat inventories in China. "A lot of the wheat was consumed last year. You can't keep using that much every year. Inventories were not plentiful either." End quote. That is what this source in Reuters said. Now, that sounds a little bit concerning if you're in China. The list of things that I don't know is a lot longer than the things I do know. And there are still a lot of unknowns here. And I also don't follow Chinese agriculture every day. However, Javier Goya 7 is a professional commodities trader. And he said that he said today that he spent the last 2 weeks, because I asked him what he made of this. He says He spent the last 2 weeks trying to figure this out, but he's been successful because not only are there lockdowns, COVID lockdowns in China, but also information blackouts because the government just doesn't report a lot of this information, or if they do report information, it's wrong information. And I bring this up because for the past few months, we have heard that China has been buying up everything. China's been buying food, buying fuel, fertilizer. People have said, I don't even know where they're keeping all this stuff. They've been buying so much of it. And that seems to me that it's in preparation of a breakdown. Somebody noticed that Chinese imports spiked. Was it a month or two? Like within weeks of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we have also heard unnamed American intelligence officials come out and say that Russian officials met with Chinese officials, and China was basically tipped off about, if not the date, then the general trend that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. And so China turns around, they start buying everything up, right, in anticipation. So let's say for a moment that our key assumption is that Chinese grain stores actually are running low, that this is not just a thing that China says, well, let's be very conservative. Let's end our weekly grain auctions just to make sure we're going to have enough. Let's say that's not the case, that inventory actually is running low, because I was just reading over on I call it my AgriWire. I got this whole dashboard set up for all sorts of agricultural data from around the world coming in. And earlier this year, the ratings for wheat, or expectations for China's wheat harvest, were not strong, mainly due to drought. Now, let's say that China actually does have low grain inventory, and then you add on these lockdowns, and this is where things get really messy for China, because there have been reports coming out about disrupted farming conditions. As a matter of fact, reports where farmers were in the field on their tractors, being pulled down off their tractors and arrested for violating zero COVID policies. And those policies come directly from the Chinese Communist Party. And all this comes from a guy named Eric Mertz. And he's been doing the math on just how much of China has been put under a lockdown. By the way, thanks to hand-waving freakoutery for sharing this information with me. Here's what Eric Mertz has to say on the situation. He's got a whole thing where he just focuses on the palace intrigue and the inner workings of China. He says, quote, a third of farmers in Jilin, Lianying, and Heilongjiang can't get fertilizer or seeds for spring crops because said fertilizer and seed is stuck in cargo holds in Shanghai. Now, I've mentioned this on the show before, the things that are happening in Shanghai with the lockdowns. This is China's second largest city. It is their largest port. And trucking in and out of Shanghai has been disrupted because of these zero COVID policies. And so things can't get to the ports. Things at the ports can't get through the city because trucking has been shut down. And this is a massive problem that's exacerbating existing supply chain issues in China. Eric Mertz writes that the situation is much worse than he previously thought. And reading through what Eric has written, you can add my name to that list as well, because we kind of knew things were bad. We didn't really understand, I guess, how bad things are. And when I'm asked, oh, Mike, do you think China's going to move on Taiwan anytime soon? And the answer is no, because I don't think they have it. I don't think they have the resources. I don't think they're in a financial and economic position to do this. I mean, they've shut down at least 40% of their GDP. They're staring another recession in the face. And I'm just not at all concerned about China making any kind of moves on Taiwan anytime soon. Now, and I'll talk about this later in the show. Now, a couple of years from now, this may change. But for right now, I'm just not that concerned, because things actually do look pretty bad for China here. And it looks so bad, in fact, that, like I said, it has made me rethink whether China, or just exactly what the risk China actually poses via the BRICS to replacing the dollar. Because if you've looked at the dollar for the past year, it's gone up versus all major currencies. So the dollar, I know your purchasing power is going down, but compared to foreign currencies, the dollar is actually very strong right now. Now, so I'm going to share. Eric made a thread about all this stuff about how many provinces and how many cities are under lockdown and how that's affecting China. I'll share that in the thread, or share that thread link in the show notes for today. So, like I said, there's still a lot of intel gaps. Some of this stuff we're just not going to be able to fill because China, in some ways, is just a black hole for information, as in nothing's coming out of there. And but this could be huge, huge, and catastrophic for Chinese President Xi Jinping, because if there is a famine, if there is some kind of catastrophic failure of China farming due to these zero COVID policies, which I just it's difficult for me to believe that they can make an error this they can make an error with this level of strategic consequences, but maybe they have. My understanding right now is that it's looking like they have. I don't know how likely his third term is going to be, and this is something I've written quite a bit over the past several years, written about it over the past several years. Xi Jinping's third term. My key assumption, what last year, it still is now, that my key assumptions have been: number one, Xi Jinping does not want a hot war with the United States. I still think that's true. And two, Xi Jinping, I think, is still going to wait for his third term to make a move on Taiwan. Xi's second term started in 2018. Presumably his third term would start in 2023, next year. So we're going to have to see what China's grain crop looks like this year. A very strong crop could bolster inventories, and maybe this problem goes away if they continue having drought. Here's the problem: just from the past 2 years, since I've started looking at agriculture a lot more frequently, like in South America, for instance, the inland parts of South America, like Brazil and Argentina, where you have a lot of farming, essentially the breadbasket of South America. Not only has there been drought, but then this arable land has been pelted with heavy rains, and heavy rains, it doesn't seep into the soil. You get flash flooding, you get floods. It's very bad for crop conditions. So they've been kind of hammered both ways through drought and heavy rains. Here in the United States, earlier this year, we were looking at the level of drought in the United States and how bad that's going to be for crop conditions. And so, at any rate, I'm going to leave this stuff here right on China. Leave it here for now, because I'm going to get with Max, and we're going to dig a lot deeper into this, and we'll release an intel report, a high side briefing for Forward Observer subscribers. And kind of on that topic, tomorrow, I give my LATAM View briefing, which is my weekly intelligence report on what's happening in Latin America, including in Mexico. Mexican politics, especially, because that's very underappreciated, the level of impact that has on the United States and will continue to have. At any rate, that briefing comes out tomorrow, and you can get that report and all of our high side briefings by signing up at forwardobserver.com. forwardobserver.com/. Let's move on now to the next topic. This Biden speech from over the weekend. He spoke at a fundraiser for the Democratic National Committee, and he commented on a number of things. We're going to discuss two things, really, I guess. All right. This is a block of text, and I'm just going to have to read it off to you because I don't have a sound bite, but maybe Ben and I can get together and work on these sound bites. Here's what Joe Biden had to say. Quote, I've had long discussions and over many, many hours. I mean, literally over, I think it's up to 70 hours with Xi Jinping. We traveled 17,000 miles, and he doesn't have a democratic, with a small d, democratic bone in his body. He's a very smart and calculating guy. Biden continues. And he's just very straightforward with me. He doesn't think that democracies can be sustained in the 21st century, in the second quarter of the century, because things are moving so rapidly, so incredibly fast, that he doesn't say autocracy, only autocracies are able to handle it, because democracies require consensus, and it takes too much time, too much effort to get it together. And by that time, the circumstance has gone beyond your ability to fix it, end quote. He continues, quote, we have fewer democracies today than we did 15 years ago, Democracies are actually receding, not expanding. Just look around the world. Things are changing, end quote. And I read this and I was immediately reminded. I have not read, but I did just buy this book today. Triple H, Hans Hermann Hoppe, has a book of essays called Democracy, the God That Failed. And it is I don't know, I guess you'd call it right anarchist or anarcho-capitalist. I don't know, whatever. But I'm going to read that book because that is an interesting thought. Democracy being the God that failed, and it just so may happen to fail catastrophically right here in the 21st century. Actually, it may be this decade. Listen, another book that I highly recommend, and man, it is a tough read to get through, and it's a thick book. It is called The Sovereign Individual. And the father of Jacob Riis, let me see, hang on. Let me get the authors here for you. All right, James Dale Davidson and the father of Jacob Rees-Mogg. His last name is Rees-Mogg. In that book, they talk about 500-year cycles, particularly for the West, 500-year cycles on which history runs. And they say every 500 years is a technological development. And you go back to the you go back to about 500 AD, and they say, in the West, this is the age of anarchy and plunder. One of the let me just add to this point briefly. I forget which documentary it was, but Dinesh D'Souza had a documentary. He talks about how great capitalism is, because in capitalism, you acquire wealth through voluntary cooperation, right? I have something, I make something, and I want to sell it to you, and I put my time into this product. I sell it to you, and then I get reimbursed for my time. All right, because I create something of value. That's prior to capitalism. He said if you wanted wealth, you just went and got it. You just went and killed somebody who got it. You stole his land, you stole his livestock, you stole his gold, his castle, whatever. You stole his resources, and that's how you acquired wealth. So about 500 AD, now all of a sudden, you're in the age of anarchy and plunder. And then about 1000 AD, you have a technological advance in which creates knights, okay, men in armor with swords. And all of a sudden, the average peasant is no longer fighting another peasant, right? He's no longer fighting just another unarmored human being. He's now fighting a knight on horseback. And they estimate, I don't know what this would be. This book was written back in the 1990s, so I don't know how much this would be in today's money. But they said back in the 1990s, a knight's armor with a sword was roughly worth about $100,000 in the 1990s, right? So we're talking about the elites of society being able to afford the armor, and now all of a sudden, this book is actually really great because it talks really about what was happening, and we tend to think about knights as being it's chivalrous, and knights are really good people, and they say no, actually knights kind of like raising hell and killing people and gaining. Just plundering people. And so the peasants got together and they went to their local knight and they said, hey, we need you to protect us, and we'll work your land for you. And now this is feudalism. And so you have technology creating feudalism. The peasants went to work for their local knight. The local knight or the local lord had knights who said, yes, we'll protect you. You work the land. And then at about 1500, you get gunpowder. And now all of a sudden, a knight's armor is not really any match for a big ball of lead. And that kind of evened the playing field, because you didn't have to spend $100,000 to buy armor anymore. You just needed a firearm, which did not cost $100,000 in 1990s equivalent. And then you kind of get this even playing field. And they say that in around 2000, that's the digital age, right? Computers and the internet that's this next 500 years of the era we're living through now. They call it the information era. And one of the things they say, this is where I'm getting to this book, their central argument is that eventually the nation state will no longer exist. the nation state, the idea of paying taxes to a central government will, at some point in this 500 years, be just as antiquated as we think of working on someone's land in the feudal system. Will be just as antiquated as we view the feudal system today. And I'm not talking about the modern feudal system. I'm talking about you're literally a peasant and you're working on someone's land in order for them to protect you. And I thought that was very interesting. It's very forward-looking book. They talk about cyber money in the 1990s. Talk about cyber money, which we would call cryptocurrencies or crypto assets today. It's a very, very good book. I highly recommend you read it. But reading through this Biden quote about how democracies are receding, there's fewer democracies today than there were 10 or 15 years ago. She doesn't believe that democracies can handle the rate of change that happens in our digital society. Can't deal with democracies can't achieve consensus as quickly as is needed in order to respond. And I thought about that book because I said, look, it may not be the contributing factor to the demise of nation states, but certainly democracies, I think there's a case to be made, as Hans Hermann Hoppe, I guess, argues that democracy is the God that failed, or will be the God that failed. And so I'm going to read that book and I'll let you know what I think. Now, moving on, Biden describes this 3-hour-long phone call with Xi Jinping. He says Biden is reestablishing ties. In this phone call, Biden says that he's going to come out and reestablish ties with global allies all around the world. He says this multiple times. And every time Xi Jinping says, well, you're only doing this to hurt China. You're only doing this to bother us. And that was one thing Biden said that I thought was interesting. Another thing that Biden said in this speech is he calls a G7 meeting, happens in England, and he walks through the doors. And he's got his little, aviator glasses on, apparently. I don't know. And he tells the leaders of the G7, America is back. And they look at him and they respond, for how long? For how long? Maybe America is back for 4 years, right? And then democracy starts to fail in the United States. And so we put all this stuff together with my next key assumption, which is that in 2024, maybe 2028, is that going to be the last? Which of those elections could it be? Could they be the final democratic elections held in the United States? I think the likelihood is very high that one of those two elections ends in a catastrophic failure. And honestly, I think we should be thinking about what comes next for Americans, what comes next for this continent. Is it democracy? Is it authoritarianism? Look, I don't know. I don't want to trade one tyranny for another. And this may sound extreme, and you may say, well, probably nothing's going to happen. I was talking to this guy on Twitter the other day. He said, oh, I'm super bullish on America. America's great. And I said, well, are you bullish on $30 trillion and growing in national debt? You bullish on $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities? Are you bullish on this hyper-partisan era that's probably leading us to a failed election over some time in the future? And so I'm not incredibly bullish on the American empire, because we know American empires end. They last roughly 10 generations or 250 years. Glubb says that. Research from Goldstone says that. Peter Turchin talks about that. A lot of independent people, and I forgot exactly what his name is. I'm gonna have to go back and look. Maybe I'll talk about this on tomorrow's show. But Glubb's thesis was that empires last about 250 years. Okay, and he gives lots of examples. Well, I read some independent research written by another guy. Again, I forget what his name is, but he went and calculated in how many centuries. So, 1.5 centuries, 2.5 centuries, whatever. How many centuries these empires last, from a rough estimate of their starting date or when that empire was born, to a rough estimate of when that empire died. And I went through and added up all the numbers, calculated them up, divided by, 20 or 30, however many examples there were. And he got 2.65 centuries, okay, 265 years which is pretty dang close to John Glubb's 250 years. And so I fully expect within my lifetime to see the end of the American empire, which says to me, maybe we just have a few more years to figure out, or maybe we have a decade. I don't know. But from my perspective, I think I think it is appropriate to begin making a generational plan or to figure out if this does happen, right? It's like wearing your seatbelt, or it's like having a flotation device or the little air thing on the plane, right? Just in case that plane goes down, you're going to be able to jump out in a raft and float around in the ocean or whatever you're going to do, right? An insurance policy. What is an insurance policy on the end of the American empires in what we have today? And what's an insurance policy if the United States, if democracy as we know it actually does collapse and we do have a catastrophic failure of credibility, legitimacy, authority, capacity of the federal government? What is an insurance policy for that? What are you and your family going to do if that happens within the next 20 years? Because I don't think I just, history says it's going to happen. We just don't know when. But I tell you, since about 2015, 2016, when I started Ford Observer doing this stuff full time, I've just kind of been consumed with that question and looking at it from historical, reading history, reading about what's happened in countries throughout history, and then applying kind of those hallmarks or those landmarks throughout history and looking for American equivalents. And that's what this new show, it's not a new show, but that's what this new channel, this new shift to my own platform over here is going to be. It's going to be a daily look at the future of the United States, because I'm very concerned that we're about to inherit something that is very, very ugly. All right. With that, we have time for a few questions. Maybe, Ben, do you happen to have? And by the way, while Ben looks for these questions for me, thanks, Ben, by the way. I'm still very concerned about an expansion of this Russian NATO, or excuse me, not Russian NATO exactly yet, but this Russian Ukraine conflict, because I keep seeing stuff come across my feed now. Apparently, Finland and Sweden are in May, according to foreign media reports from Finland and Sweden, are both beginning the NATO application process next month. Several years ago, I believe Biden said Finland joining NATO was going to be a red line. We have increased NATO support to the defense of Ukraine. We have another attack, like 100. Maybe it's 100 kilometers inside of Russia. We have this, and that happened yesterday or last night. Russian officials are blaming it, at least partly blaming it on NATO. And so this thing is far from over. By the way, last week, or maybe over the weekend, late last week, there was an explosion or a fire at a Russian defense facility that allegedly was responsible for running satellites running a satellite that was giving satellite feeds to the Russian Ministry of Defense. And that building it just happened to be an explosion, just happened to catch fire, just happened to destroy the whole building. And, so you look at that stuff, and that's clearly an escalation. And some people have asked, well, hey, at what point does Russia start responding with cyber weapons and, in response to these kinds of attacks? And man, I don't know, but I don't think the odds are great. Absolutely. I don't know if I've lost the feed or not. Sorry, I don't know if I've lost anybody, but the question is about starting a small garden to supplement your grocery store. Yeah, absolutely. I think prices are only going up from here for, probably at least the rest of this year, sounds like. I don't think people talk about food storage. They go, I got a year's worth of food storage. More than anything, your ability to produce food year round, I think in some ways more important than your ability to have food stored. The goal is not to have 3 years worth of food stored. The goal is to be able to to grow enough food and to have enough nutrition that you can where you can survive if something catastrophic does happen, which it could. All right, videos of the Chinese Communist Party slash police slash authorities placing all blame for the hunger and lockdowns on the United States. Yes, we've covered that in previous shows. How effective is that strategic messaging to their people? Well, inward, it's I can't say for certain, but I would imagine it's incredibly effective. This is what I mean. China came out in like the past few weeks, and they started saying effectively, hey, all the food shortages, all the fertilizer, all the economic and financial disruption, supply chain disruption, that is because of unilateral sanctions against Russia, which we don't agree with. And the United States is like a bull in a china shop. Or I guess in China they would just say a bull in a shop and rampaging and wrecking the global economy. That's been their strategic message. More important than how effective it is to their own people, I think how effective is it to these emerging markets, to the BRICS, as a part of this Chinese plan to kind of replace the dollar for 1/3 up to one half of the world, something like that. Historically, does a large power vacuum usually cause war? Well, I don't have data in front of me, but power vacuums get filled. Power vacuums get filled by somebody. When you look at collapsing empires, one of two things happens. Okay, the way an empire dies. Number one, they get conquered from an external force. They get conquered from a neighboring empire or neighboring country. That's number one. Or number two, they get conquered and then they get subsumed. They become a part of that next empire, which I don't think is going to happen to the United States. The other way is that they get replaced from within. So there's some catastrophic event, or there's some new trend or some new catastrophe that brings down the empire, and then you have more local leaders take over, right? And you have an empire that fractures into multiple countries, and maybe one of those countries conquers the rest and builds a new empire in the wake of that collapsed empire. I mean, you look at Roman Empire, and then you have the Byzantine Empire. So, clearly separate. Byzantine's clearly separate from the traditional Romans. Do you think food prices will ever really come back down? I don't know. It's tough. Okay, when we talk about food prices, we got to talk about supply and demand. So part of supply, demand, I don't think demand's coming down. Number one, supply, if there's not enough fertilizer and yields go down for like multiple years, then food supply goes down and things are just more expensive. The other thing we have to take into consideration is the value of our money. If I'm not saying this will happen, but if we have a deflationary bust, if for some reason we have deflation and the dollar strengthens not only against other currencies, but also the dollar strengthens against real assets, then yeah, prices should come down in a deflationary bust. And one of the things, this is a little more conspiratorial. I don't want to rename the show Out There with Mike Shelby, but because this is kind of out there. But I have seen some conspiracies on YouTube and other places talking about the plan. You have a deflationary bust and everybody gets wiped out because all of a sudden that $500,000 house is worth $200,000, right? And nobody's going to stick around and pay a $500,000 mortgage on a $200,000 house, right? They're just going to walk away. Just like people were walking away from being underwater on their mortgages in 2008, or walking away from multiple homes, walking away from their vacation home because they're just not going to pay that mortgage off. So that's something that a deflationary bust would look like. These people are saying a deflationary bust followed by hyperinflation. So not only does everybody get wiped out from the deflationary bust, but then they have no way to catch up during hyperinflation. And I'm not saying this is going to happen. I thought it was an interesting theory, and it's something that I talked about this, I don't know, 2-3 months ago in one of my Thursday early warning briefs. I'll try to dig up those notes. Maybe we can talk about it on the show. But all right, last question here. All good questions. Ben, by the way, can you please save these questions we don't get to in the show today? Let's try to answer them tomorrow. Do you think balkanization is more likely than major reform of the government if things get that bad? Historically, balkanization is one of the two ways that empires die. Balkanization meaning like the Balkan Peninsula, when the Balkan Peninsula broke up at the end of the Ottoman Empire, and you have and then even in Yugoslavia, you got the breakup of Yugoslavia, and now you've got, I don't know, 5 different countries or how many ever countries are there today, like Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, Croatia, so on and so forth. I think balkanization is the more likely of the two scenarios, and I think balkanization is more likely than major reform of the government. Now, I know people are going to flip out when I say this, but let's say that we actually there actually is an election where Ron DeSantis wins, and Republicans. I saw this funny meme the other day. It's a cycle, right? People get angry. They vote in Republicans. Republicans do nothing. Republicans lose. Democrats get in. People get angry, right? And you have this cycle or whatever it was. But let's just say the GOP does take the House and the Senate, and DeSantis wins in 2024, wins the general election. We are going to have an insurgency in this country if that happens. And I don't like to predict things because I don't want to say that I'm that certain. And I actually won't say this as a prediction, but I think it's very likely that we do have an insurgency in this country if that happens, because the incredible things we were seeing in 2020, these plans and all the organizations that sprung up around the 2020 election, and all the recruiting and all of the organizing they were doing, community organizing, they were absolutely talking about bringing this country to its knees by attacking the U.S. economy. I think they do that if DeSantis wins. And we're already starting to see. Someone said the other day, was it in CNN or somewhere? I know CNN, whatever, but they said, oh, Ron DeSantis and the imperial governorship. And I'm sure you've seen headlines too about DeSantis bringing fascism to Florida, whatever they say. They're going to build, you don't need me to tell you this, but they're going to build this up. This is going to be the second coming of Trump, except DeSantis is smarter and more politically savvy and a lot more competent than Trump is. And I do think we're going to have, if that happens, 2025 is going to be one of the worst years in American history. And it really makes me think, well, we'll leave that for another time. All right, guys. Thanks for everyone for watching. Again, if you like my daily show, you like the things I talk about, you agree or disagree. If you agree with me, please share this link, share the video, share the podcast, wherever you're watching this with your friends and family. If you disagree with me and you think I'm an idiot, please post it online so everyone else can see how much of an idiot I am. And I appreciate everyone coming over here. So with that, I'll be back tomorrow on this show, 2 p.m. Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front. All right.